Do you know Phineas Gage? As a railroad foreman in 1848, he survived an explosive accident that propelled a metal rod through his skull. Miraculously, he remained conscious and provided invaluable insights into brain science. Now, let's explore his story with Peter. This video is 12 minutes 43 seconds long. Please enjoy. Phineas Gage was born in 1823 in Grafton County, New Hampshire. There are not many details about his early life and family background, but it is said that he was born into a farm family. In the mid-19th century, many American families were like Gage's. They rely on agriculture for a living and live a relatively simple life. When Gage came of age, he did not choose to work in agriculture, but became a railway construction worker, and soon became a foreman. This job was an important profession at the time, closely related to the rapid industrialization and expansion of the United States. It was a lovely September day in 1848. 25-year-old Gage was working as a foreman, preparing a railroad bed near Cavendish, Vermont. Some boulders were blocking the railroad's path, so Gage's work is to blast away the boulders. Around 4:30 p.m., the workers were setting up for the blasting. However, because it was nearly time to go off work, the workers were distracted and forgot to lay anti-explosion soil, which prevents accidental explosion. Unfortunately, Gage accidentally ignited the explosives. The explosion sent a 43-inch long, 1.25-inch diameter metal rod hurling upward, which penetrated Gage's left cheek, pierced his left eye, tore through his brain, and exited his skull before landing 80 feet away. Amazingly, Gage never lost consciousness. He twitched a few times on the ground, but was talking within minutes. He even walked to a nearby cart and sat upright on the trip to the hospital. When he saw the patient for the first time, Dr. John Martin Harlow was shocked. Gage suffered severe burns to his hands and forearms, and there were two bloody holes on his head, one on the left side of his face, close to the jaw angle, one on top of his head. Upturned skull fragments and protruding brain tissue were clearly visible. Perhaps only a battlefield doctor could have seen this horrific scene. In the era when sterile gloves had not yet been invented, Dr. Harlow probed Gage's wound with his bare hands, removed bone fragments, peeled off the coagulated blood clots and brain matter, and tried to bandage. 5 hours later, using extremely limited medical technology, Dr. Harlow succeeded in stopping the bleeding. After developing an infection, Gage spent September 23rd to October 3rd in a semi-comatose state. He even suffered from delirium at one point, and became completely blind in his left eye. On October 7th, he took his first steps out of bed, and by October 11th, his intellectual functioning began to improve. After recovering from the hospital, Gage could walk normally and communicate with others rationally. Therefore, Dr. Harlow believed that he had preserved a good neurological state. However, his co-workers quickly noticed that something was wrong with Gage. The once polite and gentle Gage was gone. In his place was a stubborn and rude stranger. According to the descriptions of his friends and family, Gage's mood became unstable and erratic. He was very impatient with restrictions and suggestions from others, and he showed no respect for those around him. Gage lost his job because of his personality change. In the months that followed, he returned to his parents' home in New Hampshire. In 1852, Gage followed a gold rush to Chile in South America by boat. There he found work driving a horse carriage and worked for 7 years. But how did Gage, who couldn't even be a railroad worker, manage such a delicate job as a coachman? This remains unsolved. On May 21, 1860, Gage died of an epileptic seizure at the age of 36. Despite Gage died, the story is far from over. His story had attracted the attention of many neuroscientists. Around 1840, when Gage was alive, the dominant field of neuroscience was phrenology. Phrenology states that there are 27 different organs in the brain that determine different aspects of personality. By touching the ridges or valleys on the skull, you can tell a person's character. Nelson Sizer, a prominent proponent of American phrenology, believed that the metal rod passed near 13, benevolence, and 10, self-esteem, destroying the two organs, thus causing the change of Gage's personality. Although from phrenology, we can vaguely glimpse the rudiments of locating human higher functions in the cerebral cortex. But at its core, this is still pseudoscience. By the late 19th century, phrenology had fallen from prominence, and the concept of neural function localization had become the new trend in research. People had gradually begun to explore the connection between cognitive functions, cognitive processes, and specific areas of the brain. Under the guidance of this new trend, Dr. Harlow remembered his special patient. He speculated that Gage's personality and behavioral changes might be related to focal damage to the brain. But Gage had been dead for many years. His injured brain was already buried. Dr. Harlow did not give up. In 1867, after obtaining the consent of Gage's family, Gage's remains were exhumed from Lone Hill Cemetery in San Francisco. Dr. Harlow began new research. In 1868, Dr. Harlow published a paper in the Journal of the Massachusetts Medical Society. In this paper, Harlow attempted for the first time to reason about the path of the metal rod and the possible damage it might cause. He reconstructed the path of the metal rod in detail, through the skin, in an upward and posterior direction toward the midline, through the masseter, temporalis muscles, and under the zygomatic arch. Shattered the temporal part of the sphenoid bone and the left orbital floor. Entered cranial cavity, passed through left anterior lobe of the brain, and flew out near the midline, at the junction of the coronal and sagittal sutures. When it flew out, it tore the longitudinal sinus, destroyed parts of the parietal and frontal bones and part of the brain, and pushed the left eyeball halfway out of its socket. Dr. Harlow believed that Gage's brain damage was limited to the anterior and middle lobes of the left cerebral lobes, and may have penetrated the left ventricular angle. But Dr. Harlow's conclusion had been doubted, because his inference was based only on marks on the skull. No actual autopsy was performed. It wasn't until 1873 that Dr. David Ferrier experimented on monkeys, which reproduced prefrontal damage. The academic community has gradually accepted the view that frontal lobe damage can lead to personality changes and decreased executive function, working memory, self-monitoring, planning and prioritizing, task initiation, organization, impulse control, and emotional control. Dr. Harlow then donated Gage's skull and the metal rod to the Warren Museum at Harvard University, leaving a key to the past for more curious researchers. However, due to the limitations of research level, could there be errors in Dr. Harlow's records? In order to find the truth, many researchers have taken advantage of neuroimaging and worked to reconstruct the path of the metal rod through Gage's brain. The most famous of these was a 1994 study by neurophysiologists Hannah Damasio and Antonio Damasio of the University of Southern California. They took X-rays of Gage's bones and used modern computers to create a 3D reconstruction of the skull and the path of the iron rod. They concluded that most of the damage was concentrated in the ventral areas of the left and right prefrontal lobes, and involved the social brain. Such impairments lead to errors in rational decision-making, moral and social behavior, and emotional processing. This paper and the reconstructed model appeared on the cover of Science magazine in 1994. But the conclusion remains controversial. In 2004, Harvard neuroanatomists used more powerful computers to reconstruct the 3D trajectory of the metal rod. It is believed that the damage is limited to the left frontal lobe and does not cross the midline. They also determined from the angle of the metal rod insertion and Gage's undamaged jawbone that Gage must have opened his mouth to speak at the moment the metal rod hit him. In 2012, researchers at the UCLA Neuroimaging Laboratory reanalyzed images from previous studies, using MRI and diffusion imaging data to infer brain damage. They believe that cortical damage is limited to the left hemisphere, whereas white matter damage occurs both intrahemispherically and interhemispherically. The damage was limited to the left frontal lobe, involving 11% of the frontal white matter, in addition to 4% of the cerebral cortex. The damage to the white matter funiculi included the incinate, cingulate, and superior longitudinal funiculi. The mystery of Gage's brain damage seems to have been lifted. Neuroscientists have long believed that neurons cannot regenerate once they die. Therefore, functional deficits caused by adult brain damage are also irreversible. But at the end of the 20th century, scientists gradually discovered that the adult brain can relearn some lost functions, which is called neuroplasticity. This may provide a temporary solution to the mystery left by Gage. What he once lost might have been returned through years of training. So, how long did it take for Gage to change? Was he truly rehabilitated enough to function in society? If so, how did his brain regenerate, consolidate, and perfect those neurons and the connections between them? How did Gage survive the infection? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. But it is this uncertainty that has aroused the desire to explore among generations of neuroscientists. Gage's skull and the metal rod are on display at the Warren Anatomical Museum at Harvard University, and are the most sought-out items there. In 2009, a never-before-seen daguerreotype of Gage was discovered by chance. In the photo, Gage, who was blind in his left eye, was holding the metal rod. He looks well-dressed, calm, and even handsome. Alright, this is the end of this video. Thank you for your supporting.